Tonight, I want to start with something that does not look like war. It is not a tank. It is not a missile. It is not a soldier. It is a receipt from a grocery store in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in the United States, showing higher prices, smaller portions, fewer choices, because while the war in Ukraine is being fought with artillery and drones, it is also being fought in kitchens, gas stations, factories, and ports around the world, quietly, relentlessly, with consequences that most people never connect back to a battlefield. This is the story of the war you don't see, the war over energy, over food, over supply chains, over economic stability, over who pays the real price of conflict. And it begins with a pipeline. For decades before 2022, Europe ran on Russian gas, not metaphorically, literally. Pipelines stretched across borders, under seas, through forests, feeding power plants, heating homes, fueling industries. They were arteries of modern life, and they were built on an assumption: Russia would always be a reliable supplier. Politics would never override profit. Energy would remain separate from geopolitics. That assumption collapsed overnight. When Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, energy became a weapon. Moscow reduced supplies, Europe scrambled, prices spiked, governments panicked, families worried, factories slowed. Suddenly, a war in Eastern Europe was deciding whether people in Germany could heat their homes, whether fertilizer plants in Poland could operate, whether aluminum smelters in France could survive. This is what globalization looks like in crisis. Everything is connected. And when one node fails, shockwaves spread. Europe responded with speed few thought possible. Gas storage filled, new terminals built, suppliers diversified, renewables accelerated. Coal plants reopened, nuclear plants extended, consumption dropped. It was a massive emergency re-engineering of an entire continent's energy system. In less than 2 years, that is extraordinary. It also cost billions, and someone paid: consumers, taxpayers, workers. Meanwhile, Russia lost its most lucrative market. Pipelines built over decades became stranded assets. Energy exports were redirected to Asia at discounts, with higher transport costs, lower margins, less leverage. Putin's energy weapon backfired long-term, but short-term pain was global. Oil prices surged, shipping costs rose, inflation accelerated, central banks raised rates, mortgages increased, jobs were lost. A war thousands of miles away reshaped monetary policy everywhere. Then came food. Ukraine is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. Before the war, its farms fed hundreds of millions of people in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, in fragile states. When ports were blocked, fields mined, warehouses destroyed, exports collapsed, and prices exploded. In countries already struggling with drought and debt, food became scarce, bread riots returned, governments fell, migration increased, conflict spread. The war in Ukraine destabilized places that never fired a shot. This is how modern wars cascade. They weaponize interdependence. Grain corridors were negotiated, ships escorted, exports resumed partially, but uncertainty remains. Every missile strike near a port affects markets. Every insurance hike raises prices. Every rumor shifts futures. Food became financialized fear. Then there is manufacturing. Ukraine and Russia supply critical materials: titanium, neon gas, nickel, palladium, inputs for chips, for aircraft, for electronics, for cars. When supplies were disrupted, factories slowed. Semiconductor shortages worsened. Vehicle prices rose. Tech production faltered. Again, war translated into inconvenience, into cost, into delay, into frustration. Most people never traced it back, but it was connected. Supply chains that were optimized for efficiency proved fragile. Just in time became just too late. Companies redesigned logistics, reshored production, stockpiled inventory, diversified suppliers. Globalization shifted, not reversed, reconfigured, more expensive, more regional, less efficient, more resilient. That transition is still ongoing, and it will define the next decade. Another hidden front: finance. Russia was cut off from Western banking systems, assets frozen, reserves seized, transactions restricted. This sent a message: money is political. Sanctions work, but they also fragment. Countries began exploring alternatives: new payment systems, currency swaps, bilateral trade. Dollar dependence questioned, not abandoned, questioned. Slowly, cautiously, the global financial order cracked slightly, not broken, but stressed, and stress accumulates. Meanwhile, Ukraine became dependent on international support, loans, grants, budget assistance, reconstruction funds. Its economy is now intertwined with Western institutions, integration accelerated, reform pressure increased, transparency demanded, aid monitored. Ukraine is being economically rebuilt while fighting a rare experiment, high risk, high stakes. For Russia, war economy became permanent. Defense spending dominates. Civilian sectors shrink. Innovation slows. Human capital leaves. Long-term competitiveness declines. Short-term stability masks long-term erosion. This is the price of militarization. It compounds quietly. Then there is inequality. Wealthier countries absorbed shocks. Poorer ones could not. Energy subsidies in Europe cushioned impact. In developing countries, subsidies collapsed. People paid full price or went without. War widened global inequality, again, silently and politically. Economic pain feeds extremism, populism, blame, polarization. War abroad destabilizes politics at home, across continents. We are living through that now. Look at elections, inflation debates, energy politics, subsidy fights, trade disputes, all trace threads back to Ukraine. The hidden front is everywhere, and it raises a fundamental question: who really pays for war? Not only soldiers, not only civilians in conflict zones, but families buying groceries, workers losing jobs, farmers paying more for fertilizer, students facing higher rents, everyone. War is the most expensive policy choice, and its costs are rarely transparent. Putin believed he could use economic leverage to fracture the West. Instead, he accelerated diversification. He forced adaptation. He weakened his own position. But the transition is painful and unfinished. Ukraine's war has become a stress test for globalization. It revealed fragility. It forced reform. It exposed injustice. It reminded the world that prosperity depends on peace, and peace depends on restraint. The battlefield is visible. The economic battlefield is not, but it may shape the outcome just as much, because wars are won not only by armies, but by economies that can endure and societies that can absorb shock. This war is still testing both, every day, in places far from the front. For most people, energy is invisible. It arrives through outlets, through radiators, through fuel pumps, through light switches. It is assumed reliable, affordable, permanent. Before 2022, Europe had built an entire way of life around that assumption. Factories ran continuously, homes were heated cheaply, public transit depended on stable electricity, agriculture relied on affordable fertilizer. All of it was underwritten by one thing: Russian gas. For decades, pipelines delivered vast quantities of cheap fuel from Siberia to Western Europe. It was efficient, it was profitable, it was politically convenient, and it was dangerously complacent, because energy dependency is leverage. And Vladimir Putin understood that long before the first tank rolled into Ukraine. Long before the war, Russia had used gas cutoffs to pressure Ukraine, Moldova, and Eastern Europe. Short-term technical issues, pricing disputes, contract renegotiations. Energy was diplomacy by other means. Still, Europe convinced itself that interdependence guaranteed stability. That mutual profit prevented coercion, that pipelines were peace. They were wrong. When Russia invaded Ukraine, that illusion collapsed. Almost immediately, gas flows dropped. Nord Stream was sabotaged. Contracts were suspended. Threats were issued. Europe faced a choice: pay, comply, or decouple, and decoupling meant pain. In 2022, gas prices skyrocketed. Electricity prices followed. Heating bills tripled. Industries shut down. Fertilizer plants paused. Aluminum smelters closed. Chemical producers cut output. The backbone of European manufacturing trembled, governments scrambled, subsidies were rushed through parliaments, price caps imposed, emergency budgets approved, hundreds of billions were spent to shield households. It was wartime economics, without bombs, without sirens, but with fear. At the same time, Europe raced to reinvent its energy system. Liquefied natural gas terminals were built at record speed. Floating terminals installed in months. New contracts signed with Norway, Qatar, the United States. Pipelines reversed direction, interconnectors expanded, storage filled to unprecedented levels. Consumption dropped through conservation campaigns. Turn down thermostats, shorter showers, off-peak usage. Energy became patriotic. This mobilization worked. Europe avoided blackouts, avoided collapse, but at a cost. Energy is no longer cheap, not structurally. Even as prices stabilized, the era of ultra-low-cost power ended. Investments in redundancy, diversification, storage, security all add cost. Resilience is expensive, but fragility is worse. Russia miscalculated this shift. Putin believed Europe would break, that voters would revolt, that governments would retreat. Instead, Europe adapted, painfully but decisively. And in doing so, it severed a dependency that had taken 40 years to build. For Russia, this was catastrophic. Gas pipelines cannot be rerouted easily. Asian markets cannot absorb European volumes quickly. Infrastructure is fixed, time-consuming, expensive. Revenue fell, discounts deepened, leverage evaporated. What was once a strategic asset became a stranded liability. Meanwhile, energy geopolitics realigned. The United States became Europe's largest LNG supplier. Qatar expanded influence. Norway gained clout. Algeria renegotiated terms. Energy diplomacy intensified. Every contract became political. Every shipment strategic. Energy ministers became national security figures. Another transformation, renewables accelerated. Wind, solar, storage, grid upgrades, green hydrogen. Europe fast-tracked projects. Permitting streamlined. Investment surged. Climate policy merged with security policy. Decarbonization became defense. This alignment was unexpected, but powerful. Russia's war accelerated the green transition, ironically. But transition takes time, and fossil fuels still dominate. Coal plants reopened, nuclear extensions approved, temporary measures became semi-permanent. Again, emergency stretches. Globally, energy volatility spread. Oil prices spiked. OPEC recalibrated. Producers gained leverage. Consumers suffered. Developing countries faced import shocks. Fuel subsidies collapsed. Transport costs rose. Food prices followed. Energy and food are intertwined, and war tightened both. Another hidden effect, inequality. Wealthier households absorbed higher bills. Poorer households struggled. Energy poverty increased. Social tensions rose. Populist movements exploited anger. Energy became political dynamite. Across Europe, across the world. In Russia, propaganda claimed victory. Europe is freezing. Factories are closing. Sanctions backfired. Reality was more complex. Europe paid, but survived. Russia lost and adapted by burning more coal, by subsidizing domestic prices, by redirecting exports, by cutting investment, short-term stability, long-term decay. Energy infrastructure deteriorates without Western technology. Maintenance suffers. Efficiency drops. Future capacity erodes. These effects are slow but cumulative. Ukraine's own energy system became a battlefield. Russia targeted power plants, substations, transmission lines, winter blackouts, dark cities, emergency repairs, mobile generators, decentralized grids. Ukraine learned resilience under fire, distributed generation, solar panels, microgrids, backup systems. The future of energy security is decentralization. Centralized systems are vulnerable. This lesson is spreading. Cities worldwide are investing in redundancy, microgrids, storage, resilient design. Energy is no longer just economic, it is existential. The end of cheap power is not temporary, it reflects a new reality. Geopolitical risk priced in, climate transition priced in, security priced in, consumers will pay more, but they will also be safer. That is the trade-off. Putin tried to weaponize energy. He succeeded briefly and failed strategically. He forced the world to adapt, to diversify, to invest, to decouple. Energy wars reshaped politics, budgets, alliances, and daily life. The light switch is no longer neutral, it is geopolitical. Every time it turns on, it reflects a web of choices made in crisis, under pressure, with lasting consequences. If energy is the invisible backbone of modern life, food is its emotional core. People can endure darkness. They can tolerate cold. They can adjust to inconvenience. But hunger destabilizes societies faster than almost anything else. History proves this. Revolutions begin when bread disappears. Governments fall when prices spike. Wars spread when food becomes scarce. And Ukraine's war has placed food security at the center of global politics. Not by accident, by geography. Ukraine sits on some of the most fertile land on earth. Black soil, deep, rich, productive. Before 2022, Ukrainian farmers fed hundreds of millions of people wheat, corn, barley, sunflower oil, exported across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. For many countries, Ukrainian grain was not a supplement.